My name is Giles Gibbons. I'm the founder and CEO of Good Business, and I'd like to take you through the story of the work that we did with the Isle of Wight distillery in helping them to go net zero. I think it's worth saying that the excellent presentation we've just seen from Nigel was a fantastic sort of introductory presentation to my following slides. And I suppose the main message that I'd like to start with is that, as he said, whilst it seems complicated, this is for small companies as well as the bigger ones. And yes, the big companies to date have been the ones that most of the focus been around it. But I hope that what you'll see from this presentation is that you don't have to be a major corporate to be able to calculate your own footprint and support the road to net zero and gain the benefit from doing it before others. So I think it's worth just saying that we obviously the last 18 months we've been in the thick of the pandemic, and that has taken up a huge amount of people's focus, and rightly so. But climate change hasn't gone away, and we see it behind us growing ever greater. And it's been really interesting as we start coming out of the pandemic to see how the focus has returned so quickly back to the need for action around climate change. It's great that this conference and this discussion is being held today when America brought 40 of the largest economies together to challenge them to increase their commitments, which has been a really great step forward. One, to see America back taking a proactive role, but also pushing its friends and foes in the right direction. And I think that the dynamic that will come from that will really help the G7 summits focus on it in June in Cornwall, and then leading up to the COP26 event in Glasgow in November, where we hope some really strong binding targets and actions will be agreed. So exciting times. And yes, government is taking the lead, but the only people who can really deliver the net zero targets are the people who make things and deliver services, and that is the business sector. And so it is critical, as Nigel said, that we find our way through to delivering a net zero economy. Now, I'm not going to go into what net zero is, because I think Nigel's done an extremely good job in terms of doing that. But suffice to say, all the carbon and other emissions that we are leading into the atmosphere need to be reduced or sequestered in order for us to be net zero. And for us as companies, we see that as a 5-step process. The first is about calculating your footprint to know exactly where you are. Secondly, to develop a reduction plan, as Nigel was saying, along the lines of science-based targets. Thirdly is whatever you haven't been able to reduce, you can compensate through offsetting. And then fourthly, and importantly for us, communicating that to your partners and your consumers in order that they can transparently see what you're doing, how you're doing it, and support what you're doing by coming towards those businesses that are achieving net zero before others. And the fifth is about validation, and that's ensuring that that process is done in a validated way in order that it can be trusted. So, turning that theory into practice with the Isle of Wight distillery, we went through a 6-point process with them, looking at the scope, the boundary scope, as Nigel went through, scope 1, 2, and 3, and gathering the data. If we couldn't find, or there wasn't data available, we then looked at proxies and estimates for some of those elements, and I think that's a really important point that we'll come back to over this discussion. We then completed the calculations and presented them for review and discussion. Once we did that, we then worked with Javier and the team to create the reduction targets and to commit to some target setting. Once we'd done that, we then looked at some carbon offset projects and purchased offsets on their behalf in order to be able to be net zero in 2020 and develop the communications around that and go from there. So I suppose this is an important chart in a way, because I hope that what it shows is the simplicity of it for a small business. Scope 1 is the gases that were directly used by the factory. The scope 2 is the electricity used in the production. And then scope 3 is the majority, as you can see, 341 tons of carbon. Most of that is in purchased goods and services, and that 266,000 really splits into two components. One is the bottles, and the other is the grain neutral spirit. We'll come on and talk about that a bit more. And so that gave us our total, which, when we look at that in comparison to a couple of other spirits who had been through the same process, importantly, the emissions intensity seemed about the same as theirs, which is important to know that we were all sort of along the same lines in a sense. We're not sort of wildly out, either higher or lower, which gave us confidence that we had covered all the key elements. We also looked for some suitable offset projects. We particularly were interested in, because of the Isle of Wight product being by the sea and using ingredients from around the coast, we wanted to find some coastal projects here and around the world, and looked at a number of gold standard offset projects that we could link in to the process, and identified and agreed those. Here are three: the seagrass, a UK woodland one, and a Panama reforestation. We wanted to have a sort of more local one. Interestingly, the offset market in the UK is relatively small. And the offsets are more expensive here in the UK than other places around the world. But in the theory of where you sequester the carbon, there is no difference really where it comes from. It's nice from a narrative that it's more local, but that the carbon saved anywhere is carbon saved. And so we looked at a portfolio of offset projects in order to deliver the amount of offset that we needed in order for them to be net zero. And just to give you a sort of an example of how much those offsets were, that for the 70 centilitre bottle, it was about 6.6 pence was the sort of cost of the net zero process that I'm discussing, and then 3.5 pence per bottle, 5.4% for the UK woodland, and 3 pence for the rainforestation, getting us to around, as it says, 10 to 12 pence per bottle of extra cost that comes from those additional costs. But what that doesn't take into account is the financial benefits of obviously going net zero, which the reduction in operational costs when costs align with emissions, and obviously consumer appeal of being able to talk about net zero. We believe, and I think that Mermaid has shown, has had a sales increase, not directly contributed to being net zero, but it's part of the whole the overall narrative, an important part within that. So that enabled the Isle of Wight distillery to go net zero and to be able to use that and talk about it and include it in its communications, which has been a really positive process and very engaging. In terms of some sort of general learnings that we felt that we got from the process overall that may be relevant for this conversation. For some of the raw materials, there was really very little high quality emission data available, and I'm going to just go through the grain neutral spirit example of that in a moment. We do need more and better data, like Nigel was just showing around maltings for other parts of the process, in order that we can provide a more precise calculation. There is still too many estimates being used, and I think it would be great to see the sector each looking at their own carbon footprint and being quite open and transparent about what that is, in order that we can all learn from each of the elements and start comparing those, and therefore getting much better data to be able to calculate footprints across the value chain. There was little public available information on the GHG impact of peers and competitors. So again, we're still at really early days here, and therefore there wasn't a wealth of information available for us to compare and contrast where we're at. And hopefully the more brands and companies that start this process, the more that will be solved. And the standards for carbon accounting were able to provide guidance in all circumstances. So, you know, we feel very confident in where we got to, but we do think that over time, and we hope over the next year to 2 years, that the data can be improved with other players coming in and defining their footprint. And in terms of the results, the Isle of Wight distillery was broadly in line with others in terms of CO2 emissions per litre of spirit. As I said, most of the emissions were in the supply chain, 80%, and that was split down between the grain neutral spirit and the glass bottles. Transport was not as great as I think people always perceive it to be. The majority was in those two elements. And actually, during the process, you know, we had hoped that that we would use just UK offsets. It was something that the team wanted to do, but actually, the demand for UK offsets has been incredibly high. And the last that I heard is that all UK offsets have been bought for 2021. It's actually impossible to get any new UK offsets for the rest of this year. So they will have to all now be bought internationally. I completely agree with Nigel that offsets are the last element of the equation, but they are an equation in the equation nonetheless. And as long as the business is reducing by the agreed amount in the science-based targets, then if you want to be net zero, the remainder needs to be covered by offsetting. And we think that it is obviously an important component. And Mark Carney has been talking about it a lot in the last 6 months, and really showing that the sort of the offset market needs to become a much bigger, more professional sort of set up than it has been, so that it builds people's trust in it, because it is going to be a fundamental component of reaching net zero. So just in terms of, I thought it'd be interesting just so you could see what we did, because we around building the emissions intensity factor for the grain neutral spirit, because we didn't have the carbon figure for the grain neutral spirit that the Isle of Wight distillery had bought from the UK. And so what we did was we found an emissions factor for an equivalent process. It was actually one done a number of years ago in America. We took out some of the elements that we had already added into it, like product and packaging, so that we were only focusing on the emissions intensity of the bit that we needed. We then ensured that that emissions factor was sort of relevant to the average product by using data from the benchmark study of beer members. We then adjusted that for the sort of the electricity emissions intensity for the UK rather than for America, and obviously that's different in terms of different years and different emissions intensity for the UK versus America. And then we multiplied that to get the emissions factor in the per litre of grain natural spirit supplied. So we had to go out and find something that was similar and then adjust it with what we did know to get to a figure that we feel was closest to what it could be. And that isn't perfect. It's not it's not exactly as good as actually measuring the carbon during the ingredients that have been bought, but we feel incredibly strongly that it is better to start this process to use estimates in order to at least begin to have the conversation, and then over time you can see where those important areas, the material elements of carbon are within your value chain. And then you can spend time calculating the specific carbon measurement, which is now the process that we're going to be doing with Isle of Wight distilleries, looking at their specific grain neutral spirit that they buy and calculating the carbon from that. But it would be a shame to go, oh, we don't have those figures, so we're not going to do our calculation and we'll move on. I think use estimates, get going, start the process, focus in on those areas, and develop reduction plans, and get going. You know, as Nigel said, we're already late to the party on this, and we need to keep the process moving, and that is possible even if you don't have the exact data you need from your own value chain. So what next? Well, as I said, something we believe is better than nothing. Measuring climate impact is really crucial in order to reduce it, and therefore we need to get going. We need all of you to get going and do something. So something is better than nothing. Do it as openly and transparently as possible. I think the more that we recognize that actually we can all help each other in getting to an end game on this, I think we will move so much faster if the industry sees this as a collaborative process rather than a competitive one. And I think that the benefits that will come from that will be great, not only for those progressive businesses that are joined together to try and find a way through that, but for the sector as a whole. And just as a final point, we are also working with a number of partners on developing two protocols. One is the Net Zero Pub Protocol, and the other is a Net Zero Restaurant Protocol. And so these are net zero processes which any pub or restaurant can go through to help them go to net zero. And obviously, that's an important component for thinking about beer or spirits, because where it's sold and how it's sold will be, a component part of the carbon footprint. And so, again, the more that the sector as a whole moves in this direction, the better. So, if anyone would like to know more about those two protocols or what we're doing or how we're doing it, then please get in touch.